Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the building of European maritime empires in the early modern period. Once European nation-states had explored oceans in an effort to increase their direct access to distant lands and markets, they put themselves in positions to begin establishing the world's first maritime ocean-based empires. Much like their land-based empire counterparts, in Asia and Africa, the European maritime empires of the early modern period achieved the same conditions for empire building, but introduced their culture, lifeways, and dominance over many parts of the world. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these three learning objectives. 1. Explain the process of state building and expansion among various empires and states in the period from 1450 to 1750. 2. Explain the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor systems from 1450 to 1750. And 3. Explain changes and continuities in systems of slavery in the period from 1450 to 1750. Between 1450 and 1750, empires progressed to become Trans-Oceanic empires for the first time in world history. No longer were empires restrained to the continuous land-based empires that sprawled regionally and multi-regionally. Instead, the age of exploration yielded an age of transoceanic empire building that permanently altered the world's political, demographic, and cultural experiences. In many of the same ways as land-based empires of the early modern period, and how they were established, so too were transoceanic empires. Having developed a superior sense of national and cultural identity, many European states that established transoceanic empires overwhelmingly spread and oftentimes forcibly spread their culture and lifeways to peoples and places that had difficulty resisting. The early modern period was also characterized by effective state building, as many European states transitioned away from the socio-political structure of a feudalistic pre-modern Europe that had existed with relatively weak monarchs who were dependent on their landed nobility for military provisions and protections. Rather, a series of new monarchs came to power in many of the European states after 1450 and wielded considerable power over national militaries and navies and exemplified sovereign leadership that no longer needed an archaic feudal order to provide protection. These nationally recognized European heads of state led their respective states to great economic development by competing with each other for overseas land, access to markets, and luxury goods and resources. Inevitably, having achieved unified and centralized state building, European states adopted more methods and techniques in their process of transoceanic expansion. One method of expansion employed by European states that established transoceanic empires in the early modern period was through military conquest. In some cases, European vessels arrived in ports unwelcomed and had to force their way into the distant markets they sought in order to establish a trade post empire. In other cases, those Europeans who had been latecomers in the age of exploration found themselves forcibly entering into ports that had already been taken over by earlier European arrivals. However, some Europeans were more skilled at securing trade concessions with the land-based empires of the Eastern Hemisphere, rather than militarily defeating them. Therefore, some Europeans were able to get the upper hand on some Eastern Hemispheric peoples and secure some favorably imbalanced trade agreements, while other Europeans were severely limited in their economic activities in the distant markets of the Eastern Hemisphere. As the Western Hemisphere was opened by Europeans crossing the Atlantic Ocean, colonization, or the resettlement of peoples, became a method by which states expanded as transoceanic empires. These colonial empires were oftentimes established for the economic benefit to their mother nations from Europe. Though colonization was more of a method of expansion in the Western Hemisphere, That is not to say that Europeans did not colonize any parts of the Eastern Hemisphere before 1750. A final method of transoceanic empire expansion was the use of forced or coercive labor. Granted, courageous explorers set sail across unknown oceans, encountered unknown peoples, and took opportunities to develop unknown lands. But a lot of that development of land came not from the explorers and colonists, but rather from the sweat and work by coerced laborers. Portugal was one of the European states that successfully built a transoceanic empire. Sort of a hybrid, Portugal established a prosperous trade post empire in the Indian Ocean complex, beginning in the late 14th century. But Portugal also established colonies along the coasts of sub-Saharan Africa and South America. Portugal's population was not as large as some of the other European states that took to building transoceanic colonial empires. So it was not as equipped to resettle nearly as many colonists as others did in the early modern period. However, Portugal set the precedence for the building of transoceanic empires in the early modern period, as they initiated contacts with peoples in the Indian Ocean complex. Portugal's trade post empire's establishment can be credited to the successful voyage of Vasco da Gama in the late 15th century. Da Gama and his fleet of merchant and naval vessels successfully forced their way into ports along the East African coast, specifically in Kilwa in modern-day Tanzania. He also was able to secure trade concessions by way of treaty at the city of Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. Following da Gama's initiation into trade post empire building was the Portuguese general Afonso de Albuquerque. Afonso was much more forceful in his methods of expansion, as he established more Portuguese trade posts and access points in the Indian Ocean complex along the South and Southeast Asian coasts. Two of his most important successful campaigns in establishing trade posts were at the island city of Ormuz in the Persian Gulf, when his fleet defeated the Safavid Empire, and then at the city-state of Malacca on the Malaysian peninsula in Southeast Asia in the early 16th century. Ultimately, the most important trade posts that the Portuguese secured in the Eastern Hemisphere were Sofala in modern-day Mozambique, Kilwa in modern-day Tanzania, Mombasa in modern-day Kenya, Ormuz in modern-day Iran, Goa in modern-day India, Cochin in modern-day India, Calicut in modern-day India, Malacca in modern-day Malaysia, Macau in modern-day China, and Nagasaki in modern-day Japan. Portugal also succeeded in establishing a colonial empire in parts of Africa and South America. Some of the earliest Portuguese explorers navigated the Atlantic coast of Africa, and in the early 1480s, the first Portuguese declarations of land were made in modern-day Angola by Diogo Caio. Though at the time of Portuguese arrival in Southwest Africa, there was the powerful Kingdom of the Congo. Over the course of Portuguese colonization during the 16th and early 17th centuries, the Kingdom of Congo would eventually lose its sovereignty in the region. In its wake, the first European colony in Africa would be established, the Portuguese colony of Angola. On the other side of Africa, one of Vasco da Gama's later voyages resulted in Portuguese presence in Sofala, one of the long-established Swahili city-states of the Indian Ocean complex. From Sofala, the Portuguese would begin to settle colonists into the region, and ultimately establish the colony of Mozambique. Both Angola and Mozambique remained as colonies of the Portuguese Trans-Oceanic Empire until after World War II. The Portuguese were also successful in building a colony in South America in modern-day Brazil. Portuguese seafarer Pedro Cabral arrived in Brazil in 1500, and subsequent governors of Portuguese Brazil imposed tribute on natives, conquered more territory, and ultimately settled significant numbers of Portuguese colonists. Brazil remained a part of the Portuguese Trans-Oceanic Empire until it gained its independence during the 1800s. One of the most successful transoceanic empires during the early modern period was the Spanish colonial empire. Spain's unification of its last two kingdoms through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and its victories against the Moors in the Reconquista led to an unrivaled unified Spanish state that was centralized at the city of Madrid. From there, the Spanish colonial empire would be established. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean islands. Columbus's encounter with the Taino peoples of the Caribbean islands ultimately led to the forced tribute payments and forced labor of the Taino peoples. As the number of Spanish colonists increased in Hispaniola and other Caribbean islands, so too did the tribute and labor demands on the Taino peoples. In 1513, sailing from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean islands, Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in Florida in the southeastern portion of North America. As more explorers, conquistadors, and colonists arrived in Florida, more and more uneasy relations were formed with native peoples of Florida. For example, the Calusa were a difficult Native American people for the Spanish to pacify in Florida, and many of the Calusa were resistant to Spanish colonization until the first Spanish period of Florida ended in 1763. After the arrival of Ponce de Leon, the Spanish would send more explorers and conquistadors throughout the southeast portion of North America, all the way to the Mississippi River. In 1519, conquistador Hernando Cortez arrived in Mexico with about 600 sailors and soldiers, a handful of horses, iron weapons, and gunpowder. Cortez worked to establish alliances with some of the peoples of the Yucatan Peninsula, so as to work against the mighty Aztec Empire that had reached its imperial peak. It is said that when the final battle against Montezuma and the Aztec Empire occurred, Hernando Cortez had ordered his men to, quote, burn the ships so as to not be able to retreat across the ocean. In 1520, the Aztec Empire was defeated, and the city of Tenochtitlan, the once wealthy Aztec imperial capital, became the capital of New Spain, Mexico City. With Spain's establishment of New Spain in Mexico, Spanish colonists settled in droves. From New Spain, explorers and conquistadors would be dispatched into the southwestern portion of North America. For example, conquistador Juan Oñate was successful in defeating the Pueblo in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Oñate's brutal tactics against natives in the southwest of North America brought the region under the Spanish colonial empire. In 1531, conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru in South America. By 1533, with fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers, but equipped with iron weapons, gunpowder, and horses, Pizarro's men defeated the Inca Empire. Following the execution of the last Incan emperor, Atahualpa, the Incan capital of Cuzco was taken over. New Castile became the Spanish colony of South America, and over the next century, Spanish colonists resettled in South America in droves. Spain was not just concerned with colonizing the Western Hemisphere. Let's recall, Columbus originally had hoped to reach the islands near India. Although Spanish America benefited the Spanish Empire, it did not stop the Spanish monarchs from desiring access to places like China, Indonesia, and India. Exploration of the Pacific Ocean led Spain closer to those destinations. Led by Ferdinand Magellan, Spain's circumnavigation was completed in 1522. However, from the Magellan Strait in South America, across the Pacific Ocean, and into the Philippine Islands, the Spanish recognized the beneficial proximity of the Philippines to Ming China. Although Magellan was killed in a skirmish with native Filipinos, just a few decades later, the Philippines would be brought under Spanish control with the arrival of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in 1565. Spanish colonists would settle in droves to the Philippines. The Philippines would remain a part of the Spanish colonial empire until the Spanish-American War between 1898 and 1901. England, France, and the Netherlands also established trans-oceanic empires that involved settler colonies in the Western Hemisphere and trade posts in the Eastern Hemisphere during the early modern period. England established large settler colonies along the east coast of North America. After Walter Raleigh's navigation of the Atlantic coast and the failed colonial establishment at Roanoke, English colonization did not pick up its intensity until the early 1600s. In fact, after Queen Elizabeth's death and the rise of the Stuart dynasty, increased tension between the Stuarts and disloyal Anglicans and Puritans led to massive migrations of English families into North America. Jamestown, founded by John Smith in 1607, Plymouth, founded by William Bradford in 1620, and Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded by John Winthrop in 1630, were some of the earliest English colonies in North America. Over the next century and a half, England's North American colonial empire would grow to 13 colonies, and in addition, the English developed colonial settlements in Canada as well. England also entered into competition for some of the islands in the Caribbean. Spain had originally explored and established colonies in the Caribbean islands, but not all of them would remain under the Spanish crown for the duration of the early modern period. For example, Jamaica would come under English control, and though only small English settlements were made, England's Caribbean islands became outposts for African slave trading and commercial plantation agriculture. Later, in the 1700s, England set its sights on the Eastern Hemisphere and entered the Indian Ocean complex. Granted, other European states had established their presence far earlier, but that did not stop England and the British East India Company from gaining direct access and trade concessions in India throughout the 1700s. France also got involved in colonization in North America, and to a lesser extent in the Caribbean. France's settlement of New France saw significant numbers of French colonists settle from Quebec in Canada, along the Mississippi River Valley, down to the modern American states of Kentucky and Louisiana. France's colonial settlements tended to overlap with Spanish and expanding English colonies, and this generated immense conflict among these European powers for lands in North America. The French also settled the colony of Saint-Dominique, or the modern nation of Haiti, in the middle of the 17th century. Much like England's Caribbean islands, Saint-Dominique received a small settlement of French colonists, but mostly served as an outpost for African slave trading and commercial plantations. In the Eastern Hemisphere, prior to the arrival and dominance of England in South Asia, France had also established some trade posts in India and had direct access to the markets and luxury items of the Indian Ocean complex. Eventually, England competed with France for trade posts in India, including Bengal, Bombay, or modern-day Mumbai, and Madras. By 1763, the British East India Company had secured these trade posts from French control. The Dutch Netherlands also involved themselves in trans-oceanic empire building by colonizing New Amsterdam, the original site of what is today New York City. After the Dutch VOC sponsored English navigator Henry Hudson and his voyages to North America, the Dutch took interest in colonization in the region, and New Amsterdam would be settled in 1625. Granted, the Portuguese had long established their trade post empire in the Indian Ocean complex, but it would not be long until the northern European states were lured into the region of spices, cotton, pepper, and other luxuries. The Dutch Netherlands began to disrupt the Portuguese monopoly with their arrival in the Indian Ocean complex during the 17th century. In fact, the Dutch secured Cochin in India and Malacca in Malaysia from the Portuguese. Additionally, the Dutch established other important trade posts in Cape Town, South Africa, Jakarta in Indonesia, and in the artificial island of Dejima near Nagasaki in Japan. Let's understand this about the early modern period. This is really the era where Europe is starting to increase its presence in different parts of the world that it had been secluded from in previous times. In the case of the Americas, yes, Europeans utilized their ocean-going vessels, iron weapons, gunpowder, cavalry, and even diseases to defeat large empires and subjugate entire populations. However, in the Eastern Hemisphere, it did not work that way during the early modern period for Europeans. The Eastern Hemisphere would have been too much of a struggle for Europeans to conquer, so they had to accept merely establishing some preliminary footholds in Africa and Asia. Additionally, some Asian societies were not exactly receptive to the arrival of Europeans, as many of them viewed Europeans as empire builders, purveyors of foreign culture, and swindlers who could not be trusted if permitted in large populations. Although Europeans established new trading posts in Africa and Asia, which proved profitable for the rulers and merchants involved in new global trade networks, some Asian states sought to limit the disruptive economic and cultural effects of European-dominated long-distance trade by adopting restrictive or even isolationist trade policies. One example of an Asian state that restricted European cultural and economic influences was China. Recall, both the Ming and Qing dynasties in China established a prominent land-based empire during the early modern period, and in many ways they went to great lengths to defend their territory and insulate their culture. During the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation raged on and led to a great religious divide between Protestants and Catholics in Europe. The early success of Protestantism led to the Counter or Catholic Reformation, which sought to undo much of the Protestant success. Included in the Counter-Reformation was the establishment of an aggressive missionary group known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits would be responsible for the global diffusion of Catholicism during the early modern period. At that time, Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci set out from Lisbon, Portugal, and sailed around Africa, then temporarily stayed in Goa, India, and ultimately arrived in the Portuguese section of the Chinese port city of Macau. At the time, the Ming dynasty was reluctant to let foreigners into China, especially if it was for reasons other than trading silver with the Spanish or luxury goods with the Portuguese. However, the Ming dynasty allowed Ricci to enter the country and establish a missionary post. Ricci worked hard to gain the favor of the Ming dynasty by sharing scientific instruments, maps, and classical works with Confucian scholar bureaucrats. He learned Mandarin and was inquisitive of Confucian teachings. He even published The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven as a treatise that compared the teachings of Jesus and Confucius in an effort to expand the appeal of Catholicism in China. In spite of his efforts, Ricci had limited success in establishing Catholic churches and making large numbers of conversions in China, as many Chinese were intrigued by him, but were not ready and willing to accept Catholicism as a replacement or blended faith with the faiths and ideologies historically present in China. Additionally, the Qing dynasty was even more limiting when it came to Europeans and their tendency to diffuse culture. The Qing dynasty continued to limit European nations to single ports in southern China. They continued to allow the Portuguese at Macau, and when the English arrived in the 18th century, Emperor Qianlong restricted English trade to the city of Canton in southern China. In the face of great European overseas expansion, China remained in full control of its political, economic, and cultural affairs. Another Asian society that adopted restrictive and isolationist policies was the newly unified state of Japan. Prior to the 16th century, Japan had been in an elongated period of civil war, known as the Sengoku period. During that time, the first Roman Catholic missionaries attempted to convert Japanese people to Catholicism. Like Matteo Ricci, who had traveled to China, Francis Xavier traveled to Japan in hopes to make conversions to the Japanese. If Ricci's successes were minimal, then Xavier was a complete failure, as he ultimately abandoned his mission in Japan, as he deemed the war-torn country too preoccupied to hear of Christian teachings. Late in the 16th century, Catholic missionaries and Japanese converts faced persecution and were put to death. After 1600, the Japanese islands were unified under Tokugawa Ieyasu and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. Once again, Europeans attempted to spread Catholicism into Japan, but the shogunate would not allow for its diffusion. The Tokugawa shogunate enacted its foreign policy of isolationism, known as the Sakaku. In fact, during this time, the anti-Christian campaign in Japan intensified, and many missionaries and Japanese converts would be put to death by the method of crucifixion. The Japanese were very protective of their culture and also restricted European merchants to just a couple of ports near Nagasaki. Although the Portuguese had been permitted to trade at Nagasaki, eventually the Japanese constructed an artificial island near Nagasaki called Dejima. Dejima became the only location where Europeans were allowed to dock, and by the 17th century, the Dutch had arrived at Dejima. The Tokugawa shogunate extended the most trade concessions to the Dutch, more so than any other European state, as they saw them as merchants rather than conquerors and missionaries. The Japanese also enjoyed learning of Dutch arts and sciences, which spawned the Japanese affinity for Dutch learning. In spite of Japan's relative reception of the Dutch, be sure that the Tokugawa shogunate remained in firm control of its economic, political, and cultural affairs in the face of encroaching European expansion. Despite some disruption and restructuring due to the arrival of Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants, existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean continued to flourish and included intra-Asian trade and Asian merchants. Granted, Europeans became a new economic elite in the Indian Ocean complex, and in the case of the Portuguese, Dutch, and English, they became a new political and military elite in the region. In East Africa, in spite of Portuguese arrival, Swahili Arabs continued to play a role in the Indian Ocean complex. Likewise, in South Asia, Omani merchants retained their presence along the coasts of the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Gujarat merchants retained a significant role in the maritime trade of the region, and prior to the Dutch arrival, the Javanese were able to retain their beneficial position in the Indian Ocean complex. Consider Portuguese trade post empire building in the Indian Ocean. During the early modern period, it didn't eliminate Muslim merchants, and until English and Dutch arrival, Muslim merchants were very competitive with the Portuguese in the region. Maritime empire building complemented the expansion and development of labor systems throughout the world during the early modern period. Newly developed colonial economies in the Americas largely depended on agriculture and utilized existing labor systems, including the Incan Mita system. The Incan Mita system was a tributary labor system that was utilized by Incan political elites over their subject peoples. This system was continued by the Spanish in mining and agriculture in the development of the Spanish colony of New Castile in South America during the 16th century. European maritime empire building also introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, such as transatlantic African slavery used by the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English in the Americas. Additionally, Europeans introduced indentured servitude, a labor system that involved debtor and convict laborers working a 7-year contract, which was used by the English in North America. Also, the encomienda system was an agricultural labor system that was utilized in conquered areas of the Spanish-American Empire that included Native American labor. These labor systems became prominent in the colonial empires due to the increased demands in the production of crops like sugarcane and cotton. Thus, commercial agriculture, such as the plantation, or in the Spanish colonies, the hacienda, became common modes of agricultural production that relied heavily on coerced labor. By the beginning of the 18th century, transatlantic African slave labor had become the most dominant form of coercive labor in the European maritime empires in the Western Hemisphere. In many ways, Europeans tapped into pre-existing African labor systems and then altered and intensified the patterns and volumes of African slavery. Slavery and dependency was innate in African culture, as it had been a big part of post-classical African and Mediterranean societies. Beyond that, pre-modern African slavery had included the exportation of African slaves out of North and East Africa into Southwest and South Asian societies. As Europeans, such as the Portuguese, arrived in coastal West Africa, African states and kingdoms began to actively engage in the slave trade with European slavers. African slave raiding became commonplace for powerful West African kingdoms, such as Congo and Asante, to utilize their strong positions over weaker, lesser politically developed African societies. These powerful West African states became dependent on gunpowder and other manufactured goods from Europe, and it was those European firearms which were exchanged for African captives that enabled these powerful West African states to continuously enact slave raids against vulnerable societies within the region. Europeans found that African males were better suited for plantation and mining work than Native Americans, as Native Americans had no real experience in deep mining and commercial agriculture that many West Africans had experienced. Additionally, Native American labor was not suitable for plantation and mining work because of their inability to fend off diseases that were introduced into the Western Hemisphere via the Columbian Exchange. West Africa's seemingly endless source of slaves, its proximity to Europe, the Caribbean, and North and South America, garnered efficient transport of slaves across the Atlantic Ocean as part of the triangular trade. The lengthy step-by-step process of transatlantic slavery became an efficient and voluminous process, and it is important for students of history to recognize that every step in the process was intentional, purposeful, and methodical. Initial steps in the transatlantic slave system included the slave raids led by powerful West African kingdoms, such as Congo and Asante. These types of kingdoms preyed on smaller, more vulnerable West African villages that existed inland. Captured Africans would be transported by the raid party to the coastline of West Africa. Some African captives were kept in barracones, which were canopy shelters in which African captives were chained while awaiting European slave ships to arrive. In fact, many barracones were owned by Africans, and eventually some would be owned by Europeans, as more and more Europeans arrived in coastal West Africa. African captives were traded to Europeans for European manufactured goods, mostly weaponry such as firearms. The captives were then placed in the cargo holds of large European slave vessels. These cargo holds were tightly packed with as many slaves that could possibly fit into the ships. Next, the slave ships set sail across the Middle Passage, which was the long, arduous journey of Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Many Africans died en route to the New World, And some historians of African slavery estimate that approximately 4 million captives died before ever reaching the Western Hemisphere and being sold into slavery. Many African slaves attempted mutinies aboard European slave ships, but few ever succeeded. Most slave ships headed for the Caribbean and South America, specifically English Barbados, Spanish Cuba, French Saint Dominique, and Portuguese Brazil. Once in the Western Hemisphere, Africans were sent to slave auctions to be auctioned off to plantation and mine owners throughout the New World. Africans were dipped in grease so as to make their appearance healthy and physically fit so that they would be auctioned. Finally, slaves were moved to their respective plantation or mine to carry out the difficult labor of the European maritime empires of the Western Hemisphere. Ultimately, transatlantic slavery had a multi-regional impact on Europe, the Americas, and Africa. First, European societies' increasing demands for Western Hemispheric crops were met due to the productivity of African slavery during the early modern period. Additionally, the European control of global trade increased drastically due to their domineering role in the African slave trade. Thus, the material well-being of Europeans increased over time due to the volume and productivity of African slaves in the European maritime empires in the Americas. In the Western Hemisphere, African slave populations in the Caribbean and South America oftentimes outnumbered free Euro-American colonists. This was the case in places like Spanish Cuba, Portuguese Brazil, French Saint Dominique, and English Jamaica. In fact, these colonial societies were only European in terms of European political, economic, and social elite status. But demographically, these were African slave colonies. American populations were also introduced to African diseases, such as yellow fever and malaria, which led to more devastation of Native American populations during this time period. Demographically, the arrival of over 12 million enslaved Africans led to the establishment of mulatto societies, especially in Latin America. And culturally, African, Native American, and European traditions blended, and new religious constructs, such as Vodun and Santeria, developed in the European maritime empires of the Western Hemisphere. Finally, slavery had an immense impact on African societies during the early modern period. First, demographically, the West African sexual ratio between women to men became skewed, with so many African males taken into slavery. This demographic demise led to changing gender roles for African women. Many West African women assumed masculine roles in work and family life due to the enormous loss of African males, and in some cases, marriage patterns were impacted by the loss of African males. Additionally, the rise of powerful kingdoms in West Africa, who were legitimized by the slave trade, occurred during the early modern period. For example, the Asante, in modern-day Ghana in West Africa, traded gold, other scarce resources, and slaves with the Portuguese initially. Eventually, the English would arrive in the region and expand and intensify the trans-African slave trade with the Ashanti. Also, the Kingdom of the Congo in Southwest Africa, in modern-day nations of Angola, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Gabon initially benefited from the slave trade with the Portuguese. However, as the Portuguese presence increased in Southwest Africa, and as the Portuguese took liberties with slave raiding in and near the Congo, many leaders of the Congo began to resist Portuguese slave trading and maritime empire building. For example, the Congo king Afonso I and later Queen Nzinga appealed to Portuguese leadership in an effort to lessen the Portuguese presence in West Africa and the intensification of the transatlantic African slave trade. Continuous arrival of Europeans in West Africa, especially the Portuguese and the Dutch, began to challenge African sovereignty, and in some cases, European culture, specifically Christianity, altered African culture in societies like the Congo of Southwest Africa.